I was getting more into old school stuff and was reading more old school adventures. And even though I had read it before, I was doing kind of a deep read of the classic Keep on the Borderlands adventure, which is often like kind of a template for so many great adventures, because it's just, here's a little town, here's some wilderness, here's a dungeon, and that's the adventure.
Welcome to Tabletop Talk, where I interview creatives in the tabletop gaming space. I dig into their creative process and their inspirations. My passion is understanding who they are and why they make. Enjoy this interview with W.F. Smith of Prismatic Wasteland, the creator of Barkeep on the Borderlands. We talk about how a pun became a product, where ideas for a multitude of taverns came from, and what he learned from creating this award-winning book. Okay, sit back, relax. Why don't you order a pint and enjoy my time with W.F. Smith.
This is Lee.
And this is Pat.
And we're Diesel Shot. And when we're not making games, you will find us listening to Tabletop Talk and fucking up the tape.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Today my guest is W.F. Smith, or Warren Smith of Prismatic Wasteland. They're responsible for the Ennie-winning Barkeep on the Borderlands. It was successfully crowdfunded earlier this year. Barkeep on the Borderlands is a system-neutral adventure in and around the pubs and taverns of a distant keep. It introduces new procedures for running pub crawl adventures and simple rules for drinking and inebriation. So Warren, welcome to the third floor.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Congratulations on your Ennie.
Thanks. It was hard fought, and now I respect the Ennies a lot more than I did before.
How so?
No, I'm joking.
Okay. Yeah, it's a funny animal, isn't it? The Ennies.
Yeah, effective marketing tool. I'm not sure how effective as awards, but now that I'm selected, yeah. Totally
obviously, they pick the best stuff, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, this was the first time this podcast went through the process on it, and I had no expectations. And you tell yourself that and whatnot, and then you don't get nominated, and you're like, oh, it hurts just a little bit.
You're like, yeah, it's the Ennies, though. It's not me.
That's right. So, Warren, you're going to get asked the question you've been asked on many a podcast before, but I'm going to try to phrase it a little bit differently. At some point, you knew nothing about role-playing games and tabletop games, and that was put in front of you for the very first time. Can you take me back there?
Sure. So the first time I kind of had an experience playing an RPG was like the first week of undergrad. I had a friend from high school, but kind of mainly an undergrad friend who was a big D&D guy. His dad had played an older edition, and he started running a campaign for me and some friends. So that was the first time. And I remember not really grokking it at all at first. Like each time he'd be like, what's your armor class? I'd be like, studded leather. And he's like, no, the number. And I'm like, 14. But after a while, he stopped DMing, and it was only whenever I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. That's kind of whenever I really got into it. As a player, so-so. It's a fun way to spend an afternoon, but as a GM, that's what really hooked me.
Well, that's interesting, Warren, because, for you to like but not love it as a player, what would make you stupidly think that you would want to GM something like that? Like, what was that transition in your mind?
I assume it's kind of my inner narcissist. So I before doing RPGs in high school, I was kind of really into theater, improv theater. So I'm, not necessarily always need to be the center of the attention, but I do get bored if I'm not the one, talking at least 50% of the time,
Sure.
Which my interview's perfect, 50%, exactly. But as a GM, I really like being reactive and having to constantly kind of think on my feet in a way that as a player, I have a lot more time to think. And so the feeling of constantly having to react to things just isn't there. So it's fine. It's fun. I mean, I played a lot of great games. But the real juice for me is in writing adventures, but also in running them.
All right, so let's pretend that somehow I came across a videotape of the last game you played with that first GM, and I watched the whole session. And then I found at the end of that tape your first session running a game. What would I find that original GM did that you continued on? So was there anything that you found you liked the way he ran a game that really kind of helped launch you and get you started?
at least initially. So kind of, just in that transition, very similar. Because I didn't really know anything else. It was over the course of running that I kind of picked up some tips and tricks, and I started reading, published adventures, and I started reading blogs and stuff. But initially, like I would use the same, we would draw the map on like an expo board because we were in a college like conference room. So I kind of did the same sort of techniques, usually like a small dungeon. So the adventures were fairly similar. It was set in the same world. I don't think it was all the same characters, but they were characters from the same world. So there's a lot of, there wasn't a huge transition between those two. And it was myself gradually over the next 7 years of undergrad and law school that I sort of just entirely probably different in terms of GMing style.
So when we think about ourselves, growing as a GM, it's never just a linear diagonal line, right? It tends to go in plateaus, right? We have these moments where we learn something new and we level up and we just become a better GM. Looking back on it now, do you have a sense of what were your major level up moments, things that you started doing or stopped doing that you think really made a big difference in how you run games?
In terms of those kind of like dramatic shifts, usually it would have to be brought on by changing the game that I was running. So the first one would probably be switching from 3.5, which is what we used initially, to 5th edition. So I was like an early adopter of 5th edition, though I don't play it anymore. But like whenever the D&D Next playtests were going on, I was very excited about that because I'd gotten overwhelmed by the math and the prep that 3.5 often requires. And so realizing that there was like kind of a simpler version of that I could play was very elucidating for me. And that kind of led me on a path to wanting stuff that is more and more, not necessarily rules light, but where the rules all have a more streamlined function, just kind of, not complex, but just elegant.
Right.
That was a big one. Another big one was just kind of switching from D&D altogether. So I kind of bumped around. I rolled like Powered by the Apocalypse type games for a little bit, story games, which I still like inklings of, but then really came into my own and discovered the OSR, the post-OSR, through Ultraviolet Grasslands. And that was like the beginning of COVID, like the very first week of, lockdown for the US at least. I got that book, just found it online. I think it was Free RPG Day. Devoured it and immediately started designing my own system, which is the first time I started designing anything.
So what was it? What happened when you sat there and you read that and that clicked and kind of kicked in a whole new level of creativity for you? What was in there?
It's hard to untangle if it was the book or also just kind of the situation of, you're in lockdown. At least for me, work had ground to like a halt. So it was like, we're still technically working, but I had all this time, just me and my girlfriend in an apartment. And so I had this time to kind of tinker with things. Obviously, it's a very engaging book. If anybody's not heard of Ultraviolet Grasslands, it's kind of a post-apocalyptic travelogue kind of adventure, kind of Oregon Trail esque, but post-apocalyptic. So, sparked my imagination because I've always liked post-apocalyptic things. It has a very nice sense of humor to it. But the built-in system to it was kind of like a shell of a system. And I was like, I think I could add some things. And, you start adding one thing, you start adding another, and eventually, you have your own system and you started your own blog and,
So when you look back at, how that slowly morphed, right, as you started putting more and more Lego blocks on it, is there anything that was the breaking point where you just said, yeah, because I've added this was the final straw and I'm no longer just hacking this game. I'm now moving into my own system. Would you remember that moment?
I don't think there was a moment for that. So previously, whenever I was doing 5th edition, kind of my last gasp of doing that, I had started kind of doing work, kind of hacks, be like, oh, here's a new, system for rules. Here's a new kind of rule set for familiars. And those I was like, I'm just doing little hacks. And I remember one session towards like the end of me running 5th edition, a friend was like, Warren, you don't actually like Dungeons and Dragons. Like, you don't actually like this game. You're constantly bringing in your own. Every single week you have your own thing that you're bringing in that we're going to use. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, kind of right. So by the time I had got to Ultraviolet Grasslands and was kind of designing my own thing, I immediately knew that I was doing my own thing.
Right.
And so I was kind of beyond the delusion that I was just hacking, just tweaking. And I was like, oh no, I'm doing my own thing. And I even thought of the name Prismatic Wasteland, like almost immediately.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So here's a tough one for you. Is there anything you miss about D&D?
A great thing about 5th edition is the play culture.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of not necessarily the style of play that they have, but the onboarding. I think that, with a behemoth like, not just, behemoth commercially, but also just a cultural behemoth like Dungeons and Dragons, you have an endless raft of players. In fact, I think I've talking to kind of my friends who are still really into the 5e scene. There's sort of a GM shortage. It's all these players, but not that many GMs. Whereas whenever you get into the more niche sides of the hobby, everybody is like me and just kind of really deep into the games. It's like, I'd like to run something, but you can't find as many players. If I'm wanting to run a pickup game of Wonderhome, there's plenty of Wonderhome lovers, but it's harder to find than 5th edition players where you can just kind of throw a rock and they're either already playing it, they've heard of, the live streams, or they saw it on Stranger Things and they're just interested in it.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't know if players realize the GM load that's just built into the bones of D&D. And, for a lot of the D&D GMs, they've been doing it so long that they don't realize and remember the GM load. Then they go to run something else and do that for a little while and get that, system mastery. And then they look back at D&D and go, oh my God, like I can't believe how much I was carrying along the way. So that's very interesting. Guys, the Insider Insight series allows me to sit down with designers, developers, artists, writers, and creators and learn how they approach their work. I try to understand their process, inspiration, and the methods for crafting their creations. We're going to do that with Warren. When we get back, we're going to talk about his award-winning Barkeep on the Borderlands. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
So we spend all this time in the first segment talking about how you built out your own system and have created your own system, and then you release something that's system neutral, right?
Right.
The way I like to learn about what you've made is to kind of learn the process that you went through to make it. So there was a time where Barkeep on the Borderlands wasn't even an itch that needed a little bit of scratching, and then the acorn fell off the tree. What was the first acorn, now looking back on it, that ended up growing into Barkeep?
It was really a confluence of factors. I want to say there's maybe two main streams, and they met, and whenever they met, that was what crystallized it. So the first was just, so I come from a big party school. So I mentioned kind of my days in undergrad being a big part of, I came from like one of the number one party schools.
Well, you guys tell us what the school is.
Yeah, it's the University of Georgia. We have like the most bars in terms of square footage, like in America,
sure.
A major city. Just a ton of bars and just very much kind of a going out every night kind of lifestyle. And I graduated into the pandemic, and so immediately all of that was stopped. And so I kind of had some nostalgia for my more debaucherous days, and also just for socialization in general.
Yeah.
I think that 2020, 2021, we all kind of had nostalgia just for the easygoing days of socialization. So that was one factor. And the other one was just, I was getting more into old school stuff and was reading more old school adventures. And even though I had read it before, I was doing kind of a deep read of the classic Keep on the Borderlands adventure, which is often like kind of a template for so many great adventures, because it's just, here's a little town, here's some wilderness, here's a dungeon, and that's the adventure. And I was kind of taking, a side-eyed sort of reading to it. And I was like, what if, we go into the future? What happens in the setting? And the thing that really crystallized it for me was coming up with a good pun. So often my design is pun-based. Whenever I think of a good title, I'm like, okay, I got to do that.
Yeah.
And so the title that just kind of popped in my head was Barkeep on the Borderland. Just obviously kind of combining those themes of Keep on the Borderland, but also It's about barkeeps. It's innkeepers. So once that happened, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this.
So then what's next? So you've got an idea. These two streams connect. You've got a name, which it sounds to me can be a North Star for you, a lighthouse that you just start sailing towards. What's the next thing you do?
Next is just I started writing some taverns. The first one, if anybody's read the book, is The Birdcage, was the first one that I wrote, and that was just kind of inspired by. I had an owl outside my window who was just being very loud. I love my owls. I wish they'd actually return to my backyard because they eat a lot of things I don't want in the backyard. But they were screeching loudly one night, and I was just kind of thinking about birds. I remembered I had a neighbor who, or actually a friend who had a woodpecker that was endangered, and they wanted to kill the woodpecker, but were not able to. And so I thought of this bar where there was a phoenix that was an endangered species, living in the rafters of a bar. The bartender is not able to sell the bar because of it. And just kind of a little niche idea for a tavern. So I wrote that down. I start writing more. I have a lot of friends in the blogging scene, and I asked them if they'd like to contribute some. And so that kind of was the way that I went about it from there.
So obviously, if I open up the book, I'm going to find this tavern in there. What else am I going to find? I'm trying to get a sense of what people should expect when they open the book.
So the book is written so that there's really two use cases. One is to use it as a full adventure. So it has rules for like doing a pub crawl adventure. So not a dungeon crawl or a hex crawl, instead of different it's sort of a point crawl if people are familiar with that term, but through pubs. So it has procedures through that, procedures for, inebriation and drinking rules. But mostly it has these 20, and also has kind of a framework. The monarch's poisoned. The antidote is hidden somewhere among the pubs, and there's having this big festival, the Raves of Chaos, that's commemorating the fight of the Caves of Chaos all those years ago. But then there's also 20 taverns that are part of the adventure. But the second use case is you could just pull one of the taverns and just use that.
Right.
And so each tavern kind of is its own spread on the book. That way there's no page turning. You just open up to one of them, and bam, that's Granny's Cottage, or that's Our Lady of the Sacred Speakeasy.
Now, when you started working on this, which use case were you thinking first, or were you thinking them simultaneous? Were you thinking, I'm going to write an adventure, I'm going to write a resource, or do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I was always thinking simultaneously. I was always thinking both. I'm a big believer in writing adventures. I think that's just a very useful product. I don't think that that's always the product people want to write. I think systems usually get a lot of love. But adventures are just so useful, and there's never enough good ones, especially social adventures. There's a real dearth of those. But at the same time, I thought about how I typically use adventures, and it's very rare that I just take something and just run it out of the box. That seems like a lot of people are doing that with Barkeep. But what I like to do often is just, if I see something good, I will steal it. And so I wanted to make this maximally stealable. I wanted it to be like, you can read through it, and if there are 2 pages that you're like, those pages are gold, those are the best things I've read in a long time, you can just take those, plug them into almost any fantasy setting, and just run with it. So I wanted kind of maximal usability, both from the perspective of the traditional adventure, use the whole thing, to the stealing thief version, which is the way I like to do it, of just take something.
How did you put it through its paces? So once you've got kind of the first draft together, what is somebody other than Warren needs to look at this process? What's that look like?
It was actually kind of quite the process, because there was a lot of hands in this adventure. So whenever I won the Ennie, I did not win it. It was a team effort. There's, I think, 30 people all told.
Wow.
Yeah, who worked on this scene. So that's one for every 2 pages. And that includes guest writers, editors. We have a lot of artists on this project. There's multiple pieces of art on every page. And because of that, there was a lot of collaboration. So I would write something, and I would see one of the guest writers writing something in their bar. Be, oh, I see, I can connect that. Maybe change something in my bar, maybe suggest something in one of theirs. And we also had 3 editors, sort of 4, because I edited a lot of the guest bars. But it was Ava, Nick, and Ty Petrie. They kind of all took turns sort of editing it and just polishing it up. So that was kind of the next stage. And once we had it in mostly final form and edited form, we did playtests. So I didn't run the playtest. Instead, I put on a metaphorical lab coat and sort of watched some playtest on Discord, and some friends also just ran it at their own home games. which did end up, having some tweaks to the game based on those reports and based on watching those sessions. So that was kind of the process. It was writing, collaboration, editing, playtesting, and then that was the way we did it.
And if I were to look at it before the formal playtest started, and then look at it now, I'd like to get a sense of what the impact of the playtest was. So what were things that were added or removed in that playtesting process?
The playtest, it didn't change too much, but it changed important parts. So, for instance, the pubs were mostly all fine. I don't think there were any changes that came from the playtest because those were really positive. Everybody was like, I really liked the way that it worked. It was streamlined, gave me enough stuff to run. I never felt like, it was kind of a good improv partner. The book and the GM worked well together. The thing that we tweaked on were the drinking rules. So there's like a sobriety die mechanic, basically based on your character's constitution score. You have a starting die. So if you have a really high constitution score, you might start with a D12. If you're really low, you might start with a D8. And each round you're drinking, you roll it. And if it's 1 through 3, you go down to the next level. And, at a certain point you become tipsy, then drunk, then blackout drunk. And we just kind of tweaked those rules to make sure that, your characters weren't just like immediately getting drunk or blackout in the middle of it. But that actually was not the issue. It was taking too long. People were like, we went through, 3 hours and only one character, got drunk through this. And so, okay, let's tweak it a little bit. Let's tweak it a little bit. And so,
and what were those tweaks for?
Right. I believe, that it was increasing like the threshold by which you go down. So I think it was like from 1 to 2 to 1 to 3, maybe. It might have also been how often so it doesn't happen every single turn. There's a risk die or an event die, also known as kind of overloaded encounter die. Basically every turn the GM will roll a D6 and something will happen based on that. Maybe it's a random encounter or maybe it's just testing sobriety. So we increased how often the sobriety result was coming up.
Gotcha. If now that you have finished that, let's take a snapshot real quick. So there was Warren before this began, when you first got lockdown started and you first started putting this project together. There's Warren that did the Kickstarter. There's Warren that's finishing up the book, that has the book ready for purchase now. What's changed for you creatively along that path? Is there anything that you picked up that you would describe makes you a different creator than the person who started the project?
Nothing like largely transformative. Most of it has been iterative.
Okay.
Because I think even before beginning this, I kind of largely had sort of my design, North Stars and kind of the most important things to me. And those haven't really changed. I've learned a lot about project management. Like I said, it was a huge team. So it was a lot of project managing. I've learned a lot about the kind of RPG business, some things I would do different in terms of printing and fulfillment. Because that, I actually finished this back in 2022, but it didn't get shipped out until later, maybe 4 to 6 months later after I finished it. So that was a long fulfillment process. So I learned a lot there. And then also about the writing kind of design, I learned there's a lot of encounters in this, not necessarily the traditional random encounters, but, stuff that happens in the pub, stuff that happens on the way to the various taverns. And I learned how to write a really good random encounter. And for most of that, I just put it on my blog post. I have a blog, Prismatic Wasteland, and one of the blog posts is the encounter checklist. And it's just a way to make engaging, sticky situations for your players.
So would you do this again?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm already kind of, as soon as I was done with this, or as soon as I was done fulfilling it, because that was a process.
Yeah.
Already kind of have a few different things on the fire.
So what advice would you give yourself then in that process, right? Because again, it sounds like you learned a lot. What are you going to do different this time?
A lot of it is just kind of, because I think, I did a good job. I think on the fulfillment and printing stuff is mostly just, what are the best things to use? What are best practices? And they're kind of nitty gritty. So for in the future, it's more just going beyond. So this wasn't my first project. I started really small, and that's something I encourage. I think anybody who's interested in doing this is start small and scale up. So the first thing I released was a little pamphlet adventure called Big Rock Candy Hex Crawl. And it's, just a kind of double-sided, just trifold pamphlet. And it was easy to do, and I released it on Itch. It's only just now kind of in physical form. And then my next step was, okay, I'll do a zine. And this is initially going to be like a 30-page, fairly small zine, and ended up doubling in size. And
wow,
that's just part of my process, I suppose, is really just creeping out the scope. And so I think for my next project, I'd like to do a hardcover book. So just kind of continuing to iterate and continuing to build.
This is going to sound like a weird question, and hopefully it'll make sense. Why go bigger? So what's the drive to then do a larger hardcover?
One, I like challenges, so I always like doing something new. If in each product, if I'm not doing something that I've not seen in another product, product that I've read before, I'm not really interested. If I've already seen it done, I don't really care to do it. And if I've already done it before, I'm doubly not interested. But the other reason, besides just wanting to challenge myself as a creator, is that I do have kind of something that I'm building towards. So whenever I said I was making a system, whenever I first started, reading UVG, that system's Prismatic Wasteland, and it's something that I want to really do right. And I want it to be like a nice box set with all these components. And I don't want it to be like my first project. I want to be right. I want to make all the mistakes now. And whenever I'm at that point, I want it to be like, okay, I'm a seasoned veteran. I've done this and this and this. I know I can do this. And that's just kind of how I approach everything. And it's how I've been approaching RPGs. Do
you have a sense of when you'll know?
I have sort of a timeline in terms of projects that I want to do. So I've like I said, several kind of dishes in the oven, on the stove. And Prismatic Wasteland is currently the last thing I have slated. So it's sort of once I finish all of these other ancillary projects. I don't have a timeline because I work a kind of very busy job right now. So this is all kind of having to fit in the little gaps in between, like so many hobbyist creators. So something that if I were focusing it on, I could finish maybe in a month. Might take me a year, depending on how my job's going. So
right, and when I think about when do you know when, I don't necessarily think about time, right? So is there something from an accomplishment standpoint where you say, okay, now I'm good at this, now I'm ready to take on my dream project? Do you have a sense that exists, or are you ready now, but you just want to get some more projects under your belt?
I don't think I'm ready now, because what I'm wanting is kind of a large, multi-component Kickstarter. And right now I've done, a zine with some coasters and stuff, which is not the same level. I'm thinking something almost on the level of like the Mothership campaign in terms of all the stuff, all the components that were in that. So I'd like to at least do, like I said, maybe a hardback or a couple books as a Kickstarter or a crowdfunding campaign. I just want to get closer to that scope than just doing a zine. I want to get something, more similar.
So if this sounds right to me, and keep me honest here, Warren, it sounds like you know what this final product is going to look like, right? You've got a vision of what that looks like, and you don't want to learn how to do all of it on that project. What it sounds to me like you want to learn to do little bits and pieces, baby steps along the way. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. And these other projects, they're not merely just steps on an ultimate goal. They're things I want to make as well, but they are absolutely, they're staged in such a way that the more complex ones come later. The simpler ones are first.
That's cool. So guys, as everybody knows, you can scroll down. We've got links to his blog. We also have got links where we can buy the book and pick it up, as well as to his itch page. Before I let you go, though, Warren, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is talking to creators about what they consume. So obviously your hope is that people pick up this book and they just devour it, right? Can't stop talking about it. Can't stop thinking about it. Can't wait to get this bar in their current campaign. Has that happened to you recently? Is there a book or a movie or a game that has just gotten its hooks into you?
Man, I don't think I've had anything that I've been like really addicted to in a while. Probably the last thing that I was like, oh man, I'm just doing it every day was like Caves of Quad, a little video game.
Well, tell me about it.
So it's a post-apocalyptic, like, it looks like ASCII, very, very old looking graphics, but it's a roguelike video game. It has very detailed systems, and it was just a kind of a fun thing I was obsessed with for a while. But that was like at this point a little years ago. So,
well, do you have a sense of why though? So, what was it about that game that it had such a gravity for your attention?
So it had a really unique setting in terms of the Sort of whimsical post-apocalyptic is definitely kind of my zone. Like in terms of if there's media that grabs me, it's definitely in that post-apocalyptic mode. But also it was just so like, there's so many things to experiment with. The systems were so complex and like, for instance, so it's a roguelike. So you're kind of living lots of different lives because you're constantly dying and starting over. And there was just always new stuff to discover. It was just really interesting, and it was a cool world to explore.
Has that bled into you as a creator at all? So is there things about that game that you have then found showed up later, maybe even in the recent book?
Definitely. I don't know if there was anything in Barkeep specifically, but because the genre is so similar with Prismatic Wasteland, there's definitely a lot of things that I was like, oh, that'd be a cool idea to implement there. And even kind of on a smaller level. So I'm often thinking about hex crawls. One of my most read blog posts on my blog is a hex crawl checklist. And one of the things that I take from Caves of Quad into actually like D&D hex crawling is their system for like getting lost and you know, getting unlost and getting found again. And so I kind of just stole that because it worked really well for an RPG system.
That's very, very cool. Well, Warren, there's a lot of really cool things to do on a Tuesday night that doesn't entail sitting and talking to me for almost an hour about all of this stuff. So I appreciate you making the time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right. And for those of you listening, you made it. This is the end. I appreciate you listening. Take care. A big thank you to Warren for joining me today. You can find out more about their work on prismaticwasteland.com. There's a link in the show notes. Is there another subject you'd like to see in a system-neutral supplement like this? I'd love to hear your ideas. Let me know on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, or drop me a line at admin@thirdfloorwars.com. And don't worry, all of those links are in the show notes waiting for you. Please take a minute to rate, review, and share this podcast. Word of mouth is the key to getting more people listening to Tabletop Talk. Do not miss the next episode. I talk with Ross Bryant about how entertainers play and players entertain. Happy gaming, my friend. Never forget what Albert Einstein once said. Creativity is seeing what others see and thinking what no one else ever thought. Take care. Oh, hey. Are you still here? Wow. Well, the episode is over, but if you're bored, why not go to patreon.com and support the show for as little as $1 a month? Yeah, you can just scroll down and get the link. It's Patreon that makes this and all of our other content possible. Don't you want to join the other floorheads on the Patreon Discord? Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Take care.